We continue now at the top of Daf Pedalad Amar Aleph Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 84a. This Daf is sponsored by David Grossman. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Amar or a Daf, see the description box below, and see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous Amar, of Chisda said, let's say you have a sale, and in this case of the sale, the buyer actually paid more than the item was actually worth. So essentially the lokeach, the buyer, was the one who was exploited. But then later the item actually goes up in value, so now the mocher wants to retract. So Rav Chisda says the mocher is not allowed to retract, only the buyer is allowed to retract, because he is the one that was exploited at the time of the sale. And Rav Chisda here continues, because the lokeach, the buyer, can say to the seller, Ilu lo onisan, let's say you had not exploited me at all, let's say it was a fair price, lo have him matzis hadrat bach, certainly you couldn't have retracted in that case. So hashta, the onisan, now that you did exploit, now that you did charge more, matzis hadart bach, now all of a sudden you want to retract, because now it actually went up in value because of the price fluctuation. Of course, that's not going to be okay. Only the buyer in this case is going to be able to retract and not the seller. And the Gemara continues, Vitana Tuna, we learn like this as well, meaning to say we learn like this in our Mishnah, Yafos v'nimtzu ros. Let's say the original sale was supposed to be for something that was of superior quality, but it turns out that he sold something of inferior quality. Lokeach yachol lachzor bo v'lo mocher. It's only the buyer that can retract and not the seller. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rav Chisda, and Rav Chisda says, Machar lo shava sheish b'chamesh. Let's say he sells him something, it's really worth 6, but he sells it for 5. In this case, it was really the seller who was exploited because he sold it for less than it was worth. V'huzlu v'yamdu al gimel. But then what happens is it actually goes down in value. Now it's only worth 3. So at this point in time, the seller really did get a good deal. So Rav Chisda continues, Minasan, in this case, who was exploited at the time of the sale, Mocher, it's the seller who was, Mocher yachol achzer bo v'lo lokeach. So the seller is the one that's able to retract, but not the buyer. Again, the buyer might want to retract because right now it's worth much less. But since at the time of the sale, he was not exploited, therefore he's not allowed to retract. Because again, in this case, the Amar lei, because the seller can say to the buyer, Ilu lo nisan lo havi matzes hadart bach. If not for the fact that you had exploited me, you would not have been able to retract. Meaning to say, if it would have been a fair sale, of course it would have gone through. So hashta matzes hadart bach. Now you think you can retract. Of course, in this situation, since it was the seller who was exploited, he's the one that can retract and not the buyer. And the Gemara says Vitana Tuna, and the Tan of our Mishnah supports this as well. Ros v'nimtzu yafos. It says in our Mishnah, if originally the deal was to make a sale on inferior quality product, but it turns out that it was yafos, it was a good product. So mocher yachol lachzor bo. So again, in this case, it's the seller who's the one that's getting the bad end of the deal because he sold something that was of better quality than the initial terms. So the seller is the one that can retract v'lo lokeach and not the buyer. And the Gemara continues, Maika Mashmalon. Well, what exactly is Rav Chisda teaching us? Masnisani, isn't that the Mishnah? The Mishnah says exactly what Rav Chisda was saying. And the Gemara says, Imi Masnisana, if we only had the Mishnah, I might have said, Dilmar de Rav Chisda, Tarvayu Motzu Hadri Behu. Maybe in the case of Rav Chisda, really both of them should be able to retract. Because again, in Rav Chisda's case in particular, we're talking about a situation where there was a change in market value. So maybe you would say that both of them can retract, Umas Nisan, and then you would say that what about our Mishnah? Ha'asal Ashmina, and that's coming to teach us the lokeach yachol lachzor bo, that the lokeach is able, that he's able to retract. The sal kadai techamina mishum dechsiv ra ra yomer hakona, because one might have thought that a buyer always says ra ra, meaning a buyer always says that it's an inferior product that he's buying, but he's not serious about it. In other words, that might have been what the Mishnah is coming to teach, but it has nothing to do with Rav Chisda's case. And the Rashbam explains, Hachi garsinan b'seifa kamosha kasa b'sfarim. This is the proper text. My kamash malon. What is Rav Chisda teaching us? Mas nisani. It's already in the Mishnah. And the Gemara says to that, Imi mas nisan have amina de Rav Chisda tarvayo hadri behu. If we only had the Mishnah, I would have thought that in Rav Chisda's case they can both retract. Umas nisan hainu taima mishum de ra ra yomer hakonin. In our Mishnah, the reason of the Mishnah is because the buyer always says that he's buying something that's inferior. And the Rashbam explains, Kolomar means to say as follows. The Rav Chisda diika ona, in Rav Chisda's case, where there is ona, meaning to say in Rav Chisda's case, the sale was not a fair sale, somebody was exploited at the time of the sale, so tarvayu hadri, it could be, one could have said, if they only had the Mishnah, that both parties are able to retract, hoel v'nesana hama'ana levasof b'soch zman, shaya mesana yachol achzer, because at the end, when the price fluctuated, everybody really got exploited. The other person also got exploited when the price fluctuated not in his favor, and so therefore, since you were in the time where one side could retract, and then the price fluctuated against the other person, maybe they can both retract. Since we're still in the time when the person can retract, and during that time the other person also essentially got exploited exploited by the change in the market value, tarvayu hadri, so one might have thought they can both retract. And the Rashbam continues, umas nisan, and then the interpretation of our Mishnah would have been, b'deleka ona klal, where there's no exploitation whatsoever. El b'shavyein machar, it could be the Mishnah was talking about a case where it was sold at its actual value. V'achshav toin, and now the person is claiming, eini chafetz beilu, he's saying, I don't want this particular product. He's not claiming that he paid a price that's unfair, he's just saying he wanted to buy a different product. Hilkach b'machar yafos v'nimtzo ro, so therefore, for example, let's say the person, the original deal was to sell something that was good quality, and then the purchaser, the buyer, he bought something that was not good quality, and again, he paid a fair price, but he doesn't want this item, so yachol lokeach lachzor bo. So then, in that case, the Mishnah is saying the buyer is able to retract. Diamar le yafos bikashti umechitos, because he says, I wanted better quality, and therefore the purchase was a mistake. Avolim ba mocher lachzor, but in the case of the Mishnah, it could be that that's what the Mishnah is saying, and if a seller wants to retract in that case, velomar gam hani echzor shemekach tosu, he says, I also want to retract because it was a mekach tos, even though he essentially sold something that was to his advantage. He sold something that was inferior quality, but let's say he says, I would like to retract. Halokeach omer lo, so the buyer can say to him, Eino tos, that's not called a mistake. Sha'af ani bechezkas ros lekachtem, because I also bought it under the presumption that it was ros, that it was inferior. Meaning to say, let's say the seller comes along and says that the original deal was yafos, and therefore we didn't follow the original deal, it's a mekach tos, I sold you something inferior, therefore I want to retract. For whatever reason the seller decides he wants to retract, the buyer says it's not true. It's not really a mistake, because when I'm buying it, I'm always buying it under the presumption that it might not be such good quality. That's the idea of the ra yomer hakona. The buyer always says what he's buying is of inferior quality. That's always the assumption in his mind. V'seifa nami ros v'nimtzu yafos. You can say the same thing when it comes to the case where it was supposed to be inferior, it turned out to be better quality. Hamocher chozer d'amar toisi. So the seller, he's able to be chozer because he can say that I made a mistake. I didn't want to sell what was a better quality. But let's say the buyer wants to say it was a mistake and he wants to retract. For example, let's say the price in general, prices have now went down. And he wants to say, this is not the items really that were supposed to be sold. Omer lo, so the seller can say to the buyer, you bought it thinking that it was inferior, and it wasn't, vani modelach, but I admit to you, I'll give it to you anyway. That's what our Rebbe explains. And then the Rashbam says, Velinir, to me it appears that in this case, that he can tell him as follows. The seller can say to the buyer, I did not mislead you. Even though originally we said that we were selling roast, but really the presumption was that it was good. The tov yomer hamocher b'shas mechira, because always the seller always says what he's selling is good quality. So the idea is the same, essentially the reverse of what we said in the previous case. And so therefore, again, the point is that one might have thought the Mishnah is talking about where a fair price was paid, but the other side wants to retract anyhow. Even the side that got the better deal wants to retract. Maybe there was a price fluctuation after the fact, and that's what the Mishnah is teaching, that side of that person who got the good end of the deal is not allowed to retract in this case. And the Rashbam continues, Aval gabe onoas shasus, but in a case where you're talking about onah of a person selling not at the right value, let's say it's 1/6 off the actual value, to Rav Chisda, that's the case of Rav Chisda. Shein adam yodeya sha'avyav shel mekach, a person doesn't really know what something is worth at shir latagar until he shows it to the merchant. So hasam over there, lekalameim ra yomer hakone. There you can't say that a buyer always is thinking it's inferior. V'yodeya haya shakana b'yoker. He knows that he's paying more than he's supposed to. Dihav yodeya lo havizavan. If he knew that, he wouldn't have bought it. Person always wants to buy at the right value. Ela b'shavin, he wants to buy at the right value. Duhuneman liton yodeya hayisi sharos, and he's believed to say that I knew that it was an inferior quality product. V'afa pichein gamarti b'daiti liknosim, but I still wanted to buy it. The kevon sheshavos hadamim, because since it was at least worth what I paid, daiti liknosim. So he says I wanted to go through with it. Aval b'ha, but in such a case, when a person actually buys and pays the wrong price, so in that case, lo mehemen itoin hayisi yodeya di'ika ona. He can't say, if he claims I knew all along that there was ona, there was exploitation, and I still was going to go through it. V'gamarti b'daiti liknosim, I still was going to go through with it, and to buy it, the havadai lo avidinish. That a person doesn't do, and that's why essentially the case of the Mishnah and the case of Rav Chisda are different, and that's why it is a chiddush what Rav Chisda teaches, that only one side, the side that's exploited, can retract, and not the other side. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Shechamsis v'nimtzis levana v'chulu. Let's say he's going to sell him red wheat, but it turns out that he sold him white wheat. And the Mishnah goes on to say other cases of mekach tos, when you have mistaken purchases, that both sides can retract. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Papa says, Midikatani levana, from the fact that it says white, Shma mina hai shimsha sumkasihi, you see that the sun is actually red, because the word shechamsis comes from the word chama, which is sun. That's referring to the red wheat, and levana is referring to the white wheat. So you see from the Mishnah that the sun, the light of the sun in general, is red. And the Gemara says, Teda, you should know that this is true, because it's red in the morning and the evening, and the reason why we're not able to see that it's red the entire day, it's because our eyesight is not so healthy, we're not able to withstand the light of the sun and see its true color, but its true color is actually red. And the Gemara continues, Meisve, we have a question on this. The pasuk says by tsaras, umareyu amok min haor. It says it's talking about tsaras, which is white spots on the skin, and it says that it looks like it's deeper than the skin. And we say on that, kemare chama amuka min hatzel. We say it's similar to the sun, which is deeper than the shadow, than the shade. And so the Gemara now says, if we're comparing it to the sun, we're talking here about saras, v'hasam, and over there, lavanu, we're talking about something that's white. Saras is white, so it implies that the light of the sun is actually white. And the Gemara answers, Kamari chama v'lo kamari chama. When we're saying that it's mareu amok min ha'or, that the saras is similar to the sun, we're saying it's like the sun, but not exactly like the sun. Kamari chama, it's similar to the sun, da'amuka min hatzel, which is deeper. It appears deeper than the shadow. V'lo kamari chama, but it's not exactly like the sun. De'ilu hasam lavan, because whereas over there, when it comes to saras, it's white. V'hacha edom, and over here it's red. But the Gemara continues, Ulamai desalik daitin meikara, but according to what we initially thought when we were bringing this proof from tsaras, we thought to say that the light of the sun is white. So hakasam katsafrofanya, but what about the fact that it's red in the morning and in the evening? Doesn't that show that it's red? And the Gemara says not necessarily, but tzafr in the morning, to cholfa bevardi de Gan Eden. In the morning the sun passes by Gan Eden, by the roses of Gan Eden, that's why it appears to be red. And bepanya in the evening, the chalfa pischa de Gehenim, it passes over the entrance of Gehenim, and that's why it appears to be red. V'ikodi ibcha, some say it's the reverse. In the morning it passes over Gehenim, and in the evening it passes over the roses of Gan Eden. But in any case, that could be what's going on, and therefore there was a possibility to say that the light of the sun is white. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Yain v'nimtza chometz shneihen yicholin lachzer behen. If they were going to sell wine, but it turns out that he sold in vinegar, so then they can both retract. And the Gemara says, Leima masnisin Rebbe v'lo Rabbanan. Let us say that our Mishnah follows the opinion of Rebbe and not the Rabbanan. Tanya, as we learned in a Bryce, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Pedalid Amud Beis.